My name is Betsy Brown. I'm Vice President of the Save Acworth History Foundation. And today we're coming to you from Park Street here in Acworth. And if you're not familiar with it, I'll tell you that it is just across Main Street from Jones Tire Company. A neat thing about Park Street's old history, we know that it was home to a fabulous tourist attraction in its day, and also there was a college on Park Street, but that's a video for another day. Today we have Tonia Conner with us, and she's going to tell us about how special it was to grow up on Park Street.
Hi everyone, my name is Tonia Conner. Welcome to Park Street. I am the fourth generation of 5 generations of family who lived on Park Street over the years. I first came here when I was about 5 years old and basically lived here until about 7 years ago when my husband and I purchased our home, which is also in Acworth, our current home on the Cherokee County side. What made Acworth so special to me was the people, and I can say the same thing about the people of Park Street. The people here, the men and women, were kind, humble, caring people. They were hardworking people with good morals, and I'm proud to say that many of them were my family. And those that weren't my family, well, they might as well have been, because when I think about home and I think about family, I think about all the precious people here when I grew up on Park Street in the 80s and 90s. In the 1980s, this building was First American Bank, and then later became South Trust Bank. And Ronnie Heaton, who most everyone from Acworth knows, was the manager there for many years. There's the well out front known as Mineral Well, which Betsy mentioned earlier. And for me, the parking lot was a great place for me and my brother to ride our bikes in the evenings or on the weekends when the bank was closed. This home belonged to F. and Bertha McCrae. They are the grandparents of Ramona Mays, who many people from Acworth know also. F. was my great-grandmother's brother, and he was a bugler in World War I. My memories of him are him sitting on the porch, waving at people as they pass by, playing checkers, and I'm told he played a lot of checkers with Junior Prather, and also working on bicycles for kids in the neighborhood. His wife, Bertha, had a yard full of beautiful flowers. They had a pet miner bird named Prissy who could talk, so it was always fun to visit as a child and try to get Prissy to talk to us. And this is my childhood home, 4447 Park Street. It was built in 1905, and the Brands lived here originally. Around the late 1950s into the 60s, my grandmother, Ellen Cornelison Greenway, lived here with my mother, Wanda Proctor, who was a Scroggs at the time. At some point they moved to Cowan Road, and that's where I was born, and then our family moved back into this house around 1979, just before my little brother, Kevin Proctor, was born. My grandmother's husband, Elsie Greenway, worked as a crossing guard at North Cobb High School, and unfortunately was struck by a car and passed away, so my grandmother always lived with us growing up. When Mom was younger, she worked at the Burger Chief. That's actually where she met my dad, and later she worked at Battles in the deli for many, many years. Dad worked at Rothschild Mill, later on Coates and Clark, and then much later on he worked for Cobb County Schools. My brother played baseball and football in Acworth, and I was an Acworth Warrior cheerleader and danced at Miss Ella Baxter's School of Dance, and we were involved in all of the typical activities that children take part in. But I have many wonderful memories here. I spent about 13 years in this home. It's where I learned to ride my bike and roller skate. Gibson Street's right on the corner here. That was the most thrilling place for a kid to ride a big wheel back in the day. I'm not sure what's happened because I remember that hill being much steeper than it looks like it is today. But many memories of family and neighbors gathering on the porch. Dad had several gardens, a small one in the side, a huge garden in the backyard, and then actually several gardens in the neighbors' yards. And I can remember summers spent here snapping peas, stringing beans, canning kraut, just a lot of good times. When I first got married, my husband and I lived in the upstairs apartment for the first year or so. There's a wall there now, but the stairs used to come out on the front porch, and upstairs is an entirely separate apartment with a kitchen, dining room, bathroom, living room, and bedroom. So that was a nice starter home. Not too long ago, I brought back my sons, daughter-in-laws, and grandson back to this house for a family picture. So that was a very special moment. When my mother was a child, the McCraes lived in this home. This was the grandparents of Ramona Mays. I mentioned them earlier. They lived in the first house at the top of the street when I was a child. But Ramona lived here with her mother and grandparents when she was a child, and on special occasions, F would come out onto the front porch and play his bugle, scaring the neighbors who weren't expecting it. Ramona actually still has that bugle today. When I was a child, the Croft family lived here. Many may remember Ernest Croft. He would commonly be seen walking through town or riding his bike. He lived here with his parents and siblings. Later, a couple by the name of Larry and Shirley Broom lived here. Sorry. This was the site of the home of Walt and May Newberry. Almost every family was older or retired on the street as I was growing up, and only a couple of other children besides me and my brother around. So to me, it was like having many sets of grandparents, and that was a great way to grow up. I didn't really know the Newberries, but I do know that they were married for 80 years and had 10 children. Acworth once held a parade for one of their sons named Vaughn, who had been a prisoner of war in Korea, and Day Chevrolet gave him a new car when he returned. This house was the home of Jim and Lillian Cornelissen. It was built in 1903. They were my great-grandparents. They lived here when my mother was a child, and they moved to Park Street from Ball Ground in their later years. I actually have an old family video that was taken here, and I consider that quite a treasure. In the 80s, their grandson, Jack Cornelissen, who many may remember from Battles Foods, lived here with his family, and later on it was occupied by Bill and Risha Ontrican. Bill and Risha were both very talented painters. This was the home of a very special group of friends, lifelong friends of my great-grandparents, grandmother, mother, myself, and my children, the Dewberries, George, Hazel, Ginger, and Brad. Ginger and Ramona Mays and I proclaim Ginger as the mayor of Park Street because she lived on this street in this particular house her entire life and was the last of the Park Street gang to live on the street. She passed away a couple of years ago, but she loved Park Street and the people of Acworth, and I know that she would be so proud to know it was being recognized today. This home belonged to the Craig family, Frank Craig, his wife at the time, Anita, and their 2 children, Krista and Fonda Craig. In the late 80s, Bob and Louise House lived here with their family. Some of you may know Louise from Louise's House of Flowers, which was right beside Collins Funeral Home on Main Street. And James House, who worked at Collins for many years, is a relative of this family. Later on, my husband and I rented this home from Mickey Cox. We lived here about 17 years, and this is where we raised our 2 sons, Travis and Jesse. So this house holds many wonderful memories to our family, as well as my sons. My family and my sons consider this house, Park Street, and Acworth their home. The next house belonged to Ed and Ozell Fowler. At one time, Ed ran the service station on Main Street. I didn't know them personally, but I do have a memory of asking Mrs. Fowler if I could pick a jonquil from her yard. My teacher, Joanne Tumlin at Acworth Elementary, told our class that the first person to bring in a sign of spring would get a treat. And I just knew I was going to get that treat, but I wasn't the first child to get to class that day, so it went to someone else. When I moved from Park Street, this home was still occupied by members of Ed and Ozell's family. Just before you get to the end of Park Street, there's a very small side street called Park Circle, which is a dead-end road. Marvin Duncan and his family lived here. Mary Alice Duncan Wilson still lives there today. Also, the McGarity family and Jim and Effie Mathis lived in this area. This was the home of Lamar and Brenda Phillips. They lived here with their 2 girls, Shelley and Camille. Residents of Acworth may remember Brenda from working at Battles for many years. This next home was a little lady named Georgie Logan. She was a widow and sort of stayed to herself. This next home was the Nix family, James Earl and Betty Nix. They lived here for many years with their son Ken, and I do believe they had a daughter, but I'm not sure what her name is. This home is not the original house that was on this lot. My earliest memory of the lot was the Maccabee family. Mrs. Maccabee lived here with her son, R.T. She was probably in her 70s, or I'm sorry, he was probably in his 70s at the time, and he used to walk up and down Park Street daily, going to the Quick Shop and the Time Saver. And when my sons were small, Paul and Jane Wilkins lived here with their family. Paul and Jane both worked for Cobb County Schools, and Jane also worked as a manager at Save-A-Lot. And where Northcutt Station is, when I was young, there was an old house here that belonged to an older widow named Mrs. Whitlock. It was torn down when they built Northcutt Station, and the rest of the piece of land here was just woods. This was the home of Odell and Allie Moss. It was actually bought back in the 30s for $400 from Allie's father, John Brookshire. Odell planted the big oak tree out in front of the house when they first moved to Park Street and used to sit under it talking to people who passed by. He said one day he would watch his grandkids play underneath the tree, and that he did. This home belonged to my great uncle, Carl Cornelison, and his wife, Zona. Many people would know him from his years at Coates and Clark. And later on, Willie and Moselle Brand lived here, and I used to like to visit the Brands as a child to see their collection of cuckoo clocks. And the house, this is not the original house that stood here. The house that I remember being here when I was a child burned down, I think, around 1990. But this lot was the home of my great uncle and aunt, Paul and Leona Scroggs, and their son, Daryl. I have a picture of my mom in her yard across the street, and you can see the old house that used to stand here in the background of that picture. Uncle Paul's shed is still standing on the lot. Paul was my grandfather's brother, and Leona was my grandmother's sister. And my cousin Nita, their only granddaughter, allowed me to call them Mima and Pawpaw, so I considered them my grandparents too. Paul at one time worked at Rothschild Mill, and he was a great gardener and had a huge garden in the back of his property. And Leona and my grandmother Ellen spent a lot of time together and would often sew matching outfits for me and my cousin and make doll clothes for our dolls. Once Chief Nakahoma, the mascot of the Atlanta Braves at the time, was in town, I believe Pop Willis Field, for some type of event, and he actually came to Leona and Paul's house for lunch. So that was kind of a neat thing, a real celebrity coming to Park Street. This brings us to the last house on Park Street, which is actually the first house on the left side of the street directly across from Jones Tire Company. It's the home of George and Julia Pope. And I didn't know them personally, but I do have memories of seeing them basically every day out on the porch or in the front yard. And my memory of them is sitting on their front porch swing, holding hands. And I think that's a good way to end our little tour, because Park Street was a safe, happy little street full of love.
And this concludes another Save Acworth History Foundation video. We want to thank so much Tonia Conner for coming and sharing her memories of this wonderful street and Acworth in general. We want to thank Becca Keenel, as usual, for doing a great job with our video work, and Mac Turner, who is always the director in the background. We know that he's there. In the future, you know, we're looking forward to doing a video about more of the early history of Park Street when it was Mineral Well Street, and we'll be talking about the Mineral Well, which actually still exists, and we'll be talking about more about the early history of the Pope House, which was actually the college it was called a normal school, I believe, and we'll talk more about that. But for right now, thank you so much, and we'll be seeing you the next time.